Welcome to the Conscious Community Podcast. For this episode, we have the pleasure of speaking with noted thinker and writer Ken Wilber. Ken is the founder of the Integral Institute, a think tank for studying integral theory and practice. Ken is the author of more than 20 books, including The Brief History of Everything. His latest book, The Religion of Tomorrow, will be released in May 2018. Hello, Ken, and thanks for speaking with us today.
Hi, how are you?
Very well. We may have mentioned we spoke with Alan Watts' daughter yesterday, and I kind of got off on a tangent when I was talking to her. This is one of my favorite subjects, artificial intelligence.
I love Alan Watts, by the way.
And something that's been bouncing around in my head with the last few interviews that we've done and just kind of the general conversation, I brought this up in a few different interviews that we've done, is that I listen to a lot of different podcasts and I pay attention to a lot of different thinkers. One of my favorites right now is Sam Harris. I listen to his podcast religiously, ironically. And everybody in every subject area, I listen to artificial intelligence podcasts and philosophy podcasts and political podcasts. Everything from neuroscience to biology is converging on the same subject of the nature of consciousness. And what I think is really interesting about that is that it's taking philosophy, which was heretofore kind of a throwaway subject, and it's forced it front and center, because now all of a sudden the question of what consciousness is or what the self is a very critical issue, scientifically speaking. And I think it's kind of taken philosophy and it's made it this really relevant, timely thing. And you've got, I forget what's his name, the executive from Google, saying, if you want to get into artificial intelligence, you should be studying philosophy in college. And I just think that's really exciting, because I've always thought philosophy was important, but it's really become timely and important in a concrete practice way, as opposed to just theory or something that you take in college and forget about.
Yes. And, go ahead. Did you have a specific question about that? Or?
That's just generally where I've been thinking on this subject lately. I was curious what you had to say about that.
Okay. Yeah, of course. Well, there are two problems. I'm a fan of artificial intelligence, and I think it's making some great strides. But I think it has a couple of really major steps it's going to have to take, because it's essentially headed in the wrong direction. And this is indeed, in a sense, a metaphysical concept, because what you're going to end up coming out of artificial intelligence with, in terms of its attempt to simulate consciousness, is exactly what consciousness, how it's understood, what you're actually trying to create in AI. And the problem is, if you look at sort of any of the world's metaphysical systems, they're pretty unanimous that there are at least two major types of consciousness. One is relative consciousness, and that's sort of the consciousness that every sort of typical human being has, often referred to as a kind of ego consciousness or a rational consciousness or conventional consciousness. But then all of them also maintain that there's another type of consciousness. It's an ultimate consciousness or radical consciousness, or sometimes called ultimate unity consciousness, or in Zen it's referred to as having satori. In Vedanta it's a moksha. Those are sort of the central experiences of the world's great meditative traditions, the great contemplative traditions, is an experience of ultimate unity consciousness. And that's taken to be rather sort of quite different from typical everyday ordinary consciousness. And so there's really no artificial intelligence group of people really anywhere on the planet, certainly that I'm aware of, that's working with this ultimate reality, with this ultimate unity of consciousness. And there's certainly no algorithms that come anywhere near it. So then we have to look at, how are they doing with relative consciousness? How are they doing with, rationality and language translation and all of that? And the question is, relatively well in a certain sense. I mean, it used to be said even 10, 15 years ago, computers would never be able to figure out chess, because chess is sort of the ultimate in human rationality, and the computer never figured that out. And then, of course, it figured it out quite easily, as a matter of fact. Actually, chess games can be done with one algorithm. And now any computer can be any human when it comes to chess. What computers still can't do are a lot of the things that, let's say, a child can do in the first year of life. And that's because that's where all of the background components of consciousness are really showing up. And these are the components that, in a sense, are what we find in all the previous stages of evolution. So they're doing things that like a cat can do, or a deer can do, or a gorilla can do. But those turn out to be incredibly complex because they're having to do pattern recognition across multiple sensory domains. That's one of the things that computers still don't do very well, is multiple types of different pattern recognitions and creative processes. And so if you then look at, well, where do we actually get where does this relative consciousness come from? Well, what's the actual history of that? What's it actually made of? And then you can start to see why they're not doing very well with producing what's called general artificial intelligence, or artificial intelligence that can even recognize patterns across multiple different sensory domains, or different domains in general. And that is, if you take any of most of the world's metaphysical systems, they believe in some version of a type of panpsychism. Alfred North Whitehead's version, for example, is that every single entity in the universe, including like even an atom, has at least a little spark of awareness, or spark of consciousness. Whitehead called that prehension. And so I happen to believe that there's some truth to that. You have to be very, very careful about how you qualify prehension. Most people make it much too complex. I mean, an atom's form of prehension has to be extremely simple. But the atom does have an interior, and it has an exterior, and you can't really have one without the other. But the problem is, during evolution, let's say atoms first emerge, and then they have a little interior prehension, a little spark of awareness, and then they have an exterior. That's what the atom would look like if you could actually get a video camera down there and take a picture of an atom. You'd see its exterior. You couldn't see its interior. That would be its little bit of consciousness. But you could see its exterior. And atoms, at several million years later, at some point came together and formed molecules. And then that single molecule is itself going to have a prehension, its own little bit of molecular prehension. And it still contains atoms, and each of those atoms have a little bit of prehension. So the molecule's prehension, it transcends but includes atomic prehension. And then at some point, molecules all came together into cells. Cell had its prehension, but it also contained molecules that had their prehension, and the molecules contained atoms that had their prehension, and so on through the entire tree of life, up through fishes and amphibians, and then reptiles, and then mammals, and primates, and then human beings. When the first human body appeared on this planet ago, it contained atoms and molecules and cells. It had a reptilian brain stem. It had a paleo-mammalian limbic system. It had a primate neocortex. All of those have prehension. And the problem is, what computer scientists do, and most of them are, like college-age geeks who can't get laid and stay up all night staring at a computer screen and trying to figure out algorithms for this, that, and the other. But what they do is they're thinking rationally, and they're sort of skimming that rationality off the top, and they're trying to create simulations for that artificial intelligence can recreate. And to some degrees, like with chess or Go or almost any of the game shows now, they can do that pretty well. But it's all these so-called simple things that they can't do. And one of the likely reasons is that they're not, and nor do they know how, to look at atomic prehension, molecular prehension, and cellular prehension, and reptilian prehension, and mammalian prehension. Those are all there. Those also, every time we have a rational thought, it's 100 of these major transformations that we still contain in our body. And each one of those still contains a bit of consciousness. And those are enveloped. And they transcend and include, still going all the way down to quark and atomic prehension, all the way through the entire scale, up to rationality, which pops out at the top. And AI specialists skim that thin top cream off, and that's what they study. And if they keep doing that, and consciousness really does have an evolutionary history, and it really does embody its own previous stages of awareness, AI is never going to get to a general artificial intelligence where it's actually accurately representing what relative consciousness is. So it's not going to do that at all, if there's any truth to that view. And it's also not touching ultimate consciousness, or the consciousness that you would have with Satori, or moksha, or Vana, or metamorphosis, or the Great Liberation. So it's a little bit of a mixed report card that I'd have to give it.
That's interesting. I kind of had a similar idea myself, because I remember when I was in graduate school, I studied computer music, but we talked a lot about like futurism and Ray Kurzweil and his idea of the singularity. And I just thought that, to me, like, I just can't imagine how they would get to that point where the true connection that we have, like what they could do is they could maybe simulate someone, but could they truly, come up with a way to embrace that, the actual essence?
And what's a little bit frightening about that is, as you know, probably, I don't know, I would guess right now it might be almost 50-50, but there's certainly a large number of AI experts, and in general, just smart science-type people, and a large number of them maintain that as soon as human beings create a genuine machine super intelligence, it'll be the last thing that human beings do, because that super intelligence will simply wipe us off the face of the planet, not necessarily malevolently, but just in its own drive for self-survival. It could end up competing with humans, and if that's the case, we would lose. And it's if you look at one of the reasons that might happen is if consciousness really does have an evolutionary history, and of course it does, and if those past evolutionary stages are still present, and of course they are, then our human intelligence is actually rooted in the universe. We can actually understand the universe around us because we have all levels of the universe in our own being. We can understand quarks because we actually contain quarks. We can understand atoms because we actually contain atoms, and so on with molecules and cells and all the life forms that we're aware of, and planets far away and so on. We're literally at home in the universe because we're an intrinsic part of that. But if we're creating a super smart intelligence that is nothing but skimmed off the top of our consciousness, isn't rooted in anything. As a matter of fact, it's completely alien intelligence. There's no reason whatsoever to expect that it would share any of our intrinsic values, that it would have any respect or appreciation, including ours. And by simply creating a super intelligent but completely alien intelligence, we're creating something that's completely external, alien, foreign, and set apart from the entire universe. And that in itself could simply be a disaster.
What I've been wondering is if it's even possible to have true consciousness without some connection to that greater Satori universal consciousness, that maybe that is in fact what distinguishes us when we think that we are conscious or self-aware, that our ultimate self-awareness comes from our connection to that. And I think that may be where some of the disconnect is coming from in the computer science world, or in the scientific world, because that is considered metaphysical, and if it's metaphysical, then it's superstitious and it's not worthy of examination. And that's what I see with Sam Harris, where he gets so far. He started out as one of these, like very strong advocates of atheism and rejecting religion, and then you have all these concepts of universal consciousness that are, Rabbi Rami mentioned this perennial wisdom, these contemplative traditions that have this concept of like oneness. And Sam Harris talks about his experience in meditation and feeling this feeling of oneness, but he is still has this scientific skepticism and anything that could be considered supernatural, and therefore that's not worthy of examination. And if you're ruling that out automatically, then if you're trying to design a consciousness, if you're trying to design an artificial consciousness, and you're ruling out the very thing that gives us consciousness, what I've been saying lately is, just because you don't have a ruler big enough doesn't mean that the Empire State's Building doesn't have height. We may not have the tools to chart that territory, but that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't exist.
Well, it's very likely that human consciousness itself is rooted both in that ultimate consciousness, and again, the metaphysical traditions are fairly unanimous about that one. That ultimate reality is, as the Vedanta puts it, Sat Chit Ananda. It's being, consciousness, and bliss. But that consciousness, that primordial, all-embracing, all-inclusive consciousness is, or spirit, if you want to refer to it as that term, that's something that actually existed prior to the Big Bang. I mean, the whole point about any sort of universal consciousness, universal spirit, is that it's timeless, or it's eternal. I mean, spirit doesn't just pop into existence, one day and out of sort of nothing, and then all of a sudden it's universal somehow. If it's universal, it's always universal. It's sort of been that way forever. And most of the traditions, of course, maintain that we're on a kind of a cycle of evolution and involution, and involution, evolution, evolution, often referred to as the yugas, and to maintain that this universe has existed billions of times earlier, and each time spirit throws itself outward, gets lost in the lowest possible dimension, which happens to be just insentient dead matter. That's the Big Bang, and that whole outward movement's called involution. And then with evolution, it unfolds back towards realization of its oneness of spirit. And once that happens, then spirit sort of dissolves the universe and starts it all over again. But whatever you're going to do, you had that experience of oneness. And Sam Harris has had this. And that's why from the beginning, when he was part of that whole new atheist group, he would attack religions, but almost intuitively he wouldn't attack Buddhism. And he didn't attack Buddhism because Buddhism is mostly a school of liberation. It's not like, let's say, fundamentalist Christianity is, which is a school of kind of a mythic narrative. And if you believe the mythic narrative, then when you die, you get to go to the mythic heaven and live there forever. And of course, the new atheists just go insane about that. That's not a very sophisticated form of religion, of course. It's the most common, and by far the most number of people believe that. But the core of most of the world's, there's some deep core that most of them have. They often refer to it as an esoteric core, as opposed to the exoteric, outward, sort of more popular form. But that esoteric core, those are all essentially similar, and that is indeed the perennial wisdom, and that's Zen Buddhism is a classic example. And that type of oneness, when you have a Zen Satori, when you have the oneness experience that Sam Harris talks about, that oneness presents itself as being ultimately real, eternal, everlasting. You don't have that experience of oneness and then go, oh, this is just something new that happened to pop into existence today. I had this experience. You go, no, I'm experiencing something that's always been here. I just haven't noticed it. Traditions maintain that. They maintain that your typical, ordinary, average, everyday consciousness is an illusion. It's like a dream world. And then when you have a Satori, when you have a moksha, when you have a Fana, you actually wake up. That's why it's often called awakening or enlightenment. And you see reality. And this reality is that which has always been there. So it's not something, if you want to do what Sam Harris does, he's fundamentally, when he says, I don't want anything supernatural, what he is really saying, for example, is that brain chemistry is still real, and that the experience he's having is generated by a specific brain state. But that's exactly what that state of oneness denies. It's a oneness that is experienced as being completely beyond, to the extent it's that ultimate universal consciousness that existed before the Big Bang inside the brain. That ultimate consciousness is not in the brain. The brain is inside that ultimate consciousness. And so, of course, that you have to kind of accept that in terms of its own phenomenology. If you have that experience and simply say, oh, that's nothing but a particular brain state with particular brain waves, and because there are neuroscientists that have measured meditators, and they'll find, one of them actually called it a G spot for God spot. They found one part of the brain lights up when meditators have this experience of unity. But that's still to deny the reality of the unity state itself and the way it presents itself. And it does not present itself as being dependent upon a simple, finite, mortal, living brain. So, this ultimate spirit, ultimate reality, ultimate consciousness isn't created by the brain. It creates the brain. It's exactly backwards to assume otherwise. And if you've really had some of these profound satoris or kensho or moksha, waking up, enlightenment experiences, that's exactly the kind of impact that they carry. And if you're going to reduce that version of spirit to nothing but a product of the human brain, then that means the universe has been in existence for 14 billion years. And it was only a couple million years ago that a human brain was produced, and if it was only a million years or so ago that spirit was created. Well, that's a pretty pathetic spirit. I don't care what you want to call it, but don't call it spirit, because it's not spirit. It's a product of a human brain. It's an epiphenomena. And that, of course, is what most neuroscientists believe until they have an actual truly deep satori. And then they start thinking about things. But most of the traditions that have this core of satori-like awakening or enlightenment experience do maintain that human ordinary consciousness, the kind of consciousness AI is trying to reproduce. They do maintain that that consciousness is itself a product of universal or ultimate consciousness. And so to the extent that that's true, they're never going to get that part right until they figure out somehow to get AI plugged in to universal consciousness. And that doesn't mean a consciousness dependent on a human brain. It means a consciousness that exists prior to a human brain. And if you want to know what the universe is like prior to the Big Bang, what it's like prior to manifestation itself, simply have a satori, and it'll hit you right in the face. So that's a real problem.
Well, I think that's, honestly, I think that's when general AI is created, I think what we will find is that it may be somewhat akin to interacting with a being that is in a permanent state of satori. So that's one concept I've kicked around, is that when we turn on the first artificial intelligence, basically you'll have a hotline.
Sounds like, yeah,
you'll have a direct interface with something that is in a permanent state of that consciousness. And I think that's one reason why religious fundamentalists have such a hard time with AI, because if you plug into that ultimate, universal spirit and it disagrees with some of your fundamentalist dogma, it's whatever it is, it's not going to repeat back the dogma of any major world religion. It may have a lot in common with some of this perennial wisdom stuff. I think we probably hit the nail on the head with some of that in various traditions, but I really doubt it's going to agree with Catholicism or some other branded religions, dictates about what you can eat and all that other stuff. I think that's very threatening for those religions, and they don't want a God machine.
It's interesting that we get to the point, like you were saying, where the universe repeats itself, that it's almost like we're on the brink of discovering that. We were watching a TED Talk, and it was a computer was generating design, and it was fascinating how organic the design was, and it was like it was trying to create the best, was creating nature, and it was almost like going back in time. Like there's a
that's the part. Yeah, that's the part that I'm referring to as ordinary relative consciousness with its evolutionary background. Yeah. All of those atomic prehensions, molecular prehensions, the cellular prehensions, all that. And I think that's one of the components that an AI is going to have to plug into. So, in other words, an AI, even if it could plug in to the other end, which I think is the second part that it will have to do, it will have to plug into a universal mind. But if it just did that, based on the way, let's say, AI is right now, which is just sort of skimmed off the top, the kind of version of consciousness, it doesn't include all of that 14 billion evolutionary year history of consciousness. If it just plugged into universal mind, it really wouldn't know how to translate it. It wouldn't know how to interact with it in a full way, because that universal mind has produced all of these earlier stages of mind, of just sort of bigger and bigger, more complex, more conscious versions of universal mind, starting at the very, very lowest, the little quark prehension or the little atom prehension. And that was universal mind showing up at that stage. That's what it would look like. And then it itself, kept expanding and growing and transcending and including. And that whole drive is what actually has driven evolution to continue to move upward. Evolution isn't running down. It's not winding down. It's winding up. The evolutionary scale has gotten more complex, more conscious, more unified, and more whole. I mean, we've gone from dirt to the sonnets of Shakespeare. That's not winding down. That's winding up. So we're going to have to, in a sense, plug into both of those aspects if we're really going to get onto consciousness. And that's why it is such an interesting area of research right now. And it is why somebody at Google would say, well, you better study philosophy because, man, we're really up against it here. We don't really even know what we're doing here. And that's correct.
Yeah, how can you build a conscious machine when you can't define consciousness, is what
Exactly.
I keep hearing over and over again, is and when it came time that they realized that was the problem, well, the study of consciousness going back thousands of years has been philosophy. And all of a sudden, those guys that couldn't get jobs with their PhDs are all of a sudden like, hey, what do you guys think of this? Because you've actually been studying this and working at some, menial job because you've got a PhD that was a subject that nobody considered important 10 years ago.
Well, the nature of our world is changing so quickly. I mean, we need less and less of these, I guess you call them concrete type. We've talked
what?
Like concrete things, like the people who are engineers, people who build physical things. We need more and more people who build thought, and even the arts. We've talked to a couple people about that previously, about the value of the art being something that has an intrinsic value that perhaps a computer without consciousness cannot reproduce. It cannot produce meaningful art.
Music according to certain algorithms, or it can do a painting just in a certain style. It can take a photographic image and recreate that in the style of Van Gogh or whatever, but it can't have that creative experience that for most artists is an experience of tapping into that universal consciousness. There's a lot of artists talk about how it doesn't come from them, it comes through them, and when they're in that flow state and they're painting a painting, it's coming from that universal consciousness. So in order to create a computer that could create a creative work in that way, it would need to be able to tap into that.
Well, yeah, exactly, and it's the whole aesthetic domain. There are an awful lot of philosophers, particularly Western philosophers, that were aware of Satori, but we're trying to look at ways to sort of, in a sense, kind of philosophically make sense out of it. And one of the most common ways was through aesthetics, and one of the reasons is that aesthetics is of sort of all the endeavors that human beings get engaged in. Aesthetics is one that eminently makes use of just the present immediate experience. So it's just an immediate impact that you get, whether you're listening to music or whether you're watching dance or whether you're looking at a painting. It's just this immediate, incredible impact that you get, and you kind of react to it as a whole immediately. And that has a lot of kind of similar sounding things to something like Satori. And so a lot of a fair number of Western philosophers, certainly in the idealist tradition, have in a sense tried to say, okay, aesthetics, we all have this immediate aesthetic apprehension, and that in itself is a non-dual awareness. That awareness is itself this universal consciousness just hitting us, right in the face, so to speak. But then we back up away from it. We start thinking about it. We conceptualize it. We divide ourselves from the experience. We cut it into a subject and an object. And then, of course, all of a sudden we're in the realm of Maya, and we're in the conventional realm. We've lost track of ultimate reality kind of entirely. And I think there's a little bit of truth to that. I think you have to be a little bit careful, because most of the really, really super philosophers that are working with that ultimate consciousness, most of them follow, at least in some ways, the sort of fundamental line of Nagarjuna, who founded essentially all of Madhyamaka Buddhism, which sort of, in a sense, became all of Mahayana Buddhism, and his notion of shunyata, or emptiness. So when it comes to even the thinking about this ultimate universal consciousness, you really can't describe or conceive it in any way that's actually accurate. And Nagarjuna would say the reason is that any concept you think of really only makes sense in terms of its opposite. So it's, infinite versus finite, good versus bad, pleasure versus pain, up versus down, in versus out. The mind is a pretty dualistic thing. So almost any concept we think of only has meaning in terms of its opposite. But this ultimate reality doesn't have an opposite, because it's radically, radically all-inclusive. And so it's really completely unconceptualizable. It's unqualifiable. It's beyond any sort of thoughts or concepts that we can actually use, including that one. And so that's what Nagarjuna called emptiness, or shunyata. And it basically said it can either be called emptiness or not emptiness, but in order to point it out, we call with emptiness. And that's fairly true. It's pointing to just the radically all-inclusive nature of this ultimate reality. And so you find this in a lot of the traditions with so-called negative mysticism. In Christianity, it's called apophatic mysticism. And this includes things like the cloud of unknowing. So if you pick up any of these treatises, they're essentially all variations on the Sanskrit phrase nete nete. It's not this, it's not that. So whatever you can think of, it's ultimately denied. So even the cloud of unknowing will say God is not light, is not love, is not care, is not compassion, is not all-inclusive, and on through every single concept you can think of, both positive and negative, and all of them are denied. And the reason is that it's just this immediate, radical experience in this moment, this experience of oneness with absolutely everything that's arising. And that is hard to specifically conceptualize. So a lot of people have tried, and there are a lot of philosophical schools and traditions, East and West, that attempt to do this, but most of them start at the core by saying, okay, we really can't say anything about it, and what we're going to say now is going to be sort of metaphoric, and then they'll kind of start out that way. But they'll all maintain that nonetheless, this completely unqualifiable thing that we can't really describe, it turns out we can know it, describe it. Nonetheless, we can actually awaken directly to it. We can have a direct experience of that. And that is indeed Satori. That's awakening. That's enlightenment. And it's just a reminder that what's required is a change of consciousness from our relative, ordinary, typical consciousness, which is divided, dualistic, conceptual, analytic, etc., to this ultimate unity consciousness, which is one with absolutely everything that's arising moment to moment. So the core of those traditions is the absolute mandate that we have this change of consciousness. That is, you can really, anything you say about that ultimate unity, if you haven't had that change of consciousness, anything you say about it is categorically wrong because you're not actually and correctly aware of it. And then when you're actually and correctly aware of it, pretty much anything you can say will be fine. I mean, you directly are knowing it. And so you don't need to describe it or think about it or verbalize it or anything like that. But the whole point of those traditions of saying, well, it's not this, it's not that, is to say, whatever you think about it, that's not what it is. What it is what you will directly experience once you actually awaken. And then there are certain kinds of practices and exercises that you can do, usually some form of meditation, that will help you relax your typical thinking and allow this more primordial, ever-present awareness and direct connection with ultimate consciousness. Allow that to pop forth, and you become directly aware of that, and that's enlightenment, that's awakening, that's Satori, and then things are very cool.
It's interesting. We were just talking about this morning, that things really are a lot simpler than people want them to be. Like having that experience is really a very simple thing, and people overcomplicate it. They get, I guess they don't see the forest for the trees type thing. They see the ritual or the process, but they don't just understand that you just have to, you'll just get there. That makes sense. Like I was reading in The Golden Present, and if you're familiar with that book, like a devotional book by the guru from Yogaville, he says, right, well, you could just wake up today, like how do I know it's going to happen? Is one of the students asked him, and he says, well, it could just happen today, or it might not happen. Have to sort of accept it, I guess, and not
right. Yeah, the Tibetans have a saying, too simple to believe. And that pretty much sort of summarizes that ultimate awareness. All the traditions are pretty unanimous. It's an awareness that we have fully present in us right now. Literally, 100% of the enlightened mind is present in each of us right now. Not 95% of it, not 97% of it, 100% of it is fully present right now. It's fully functional, it's fully operational. And when we actually have a genuine Satori or something, we'll realize it. We'll go, oh, God, I've been staring at this my whole life. Why didn't I see it? I mean, it's really that. One of the reasons it's hard to see is because it is so simple and it is so ever-present.
There's a lot of talk about that in Taoism, that a lot of the Taoist writings are talking about how the Tao is what you can't describe. It's almost, it reminds me of in the scientific world that we have figured out so much about the universe, and one of the arguments from the new atheists is that the space for God to exist is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and so the spiritual people are just moving the goalposts, and that the things that we haven't explained is always, that's where God is. He's just in that little narrowing space that we haven't explained with science. But that's exactly true, because there is that thing that no matter how specific you get, no matter how specifically you describe the universe, there is always an essential substance or an essential thing, the Tao that is outside of what you can explain, and it's without form, and you can't describe something that has no form with words. Words are a form. You can't describe something that doesn't have a form with words that are contained within that which does have form. It's like the map is never the territory that it describes. In all words, in all conceptualization, and pictures you can draw or diagrams you can make to explain the Tao are always specific and explicit, and not it exists outside of them.
Yeah, a metaphor. It's not all that accurate, but it gives a kind of a simplistic indication of what's involved, and that is, if you just take like a large blank white sheet of paper, and then you take a blue crayon and you draw some triangles and some circles and some squares and some trees and some fish and some birds and some airplanes and all of that, and so you've drawn all those things with this blue crayon, and so you're looking at all of them, and in a sense, what's true is that blue is the actual sort of substance of all of those things. But you can't say that blue is just a triangle, and you can't say it's a circle, and you can't say it's a square, and it's not an airplane. It's none of those things. It's the actual substance of all. It's the color of all of those. Another similar example is, and this one's used a fair amount, if you talk about an ocean and its waves, it's not just the simple point that the wave is one with the ocean. It's more the concept of wetness. So if you look at all the waves coming off the ocean, some of the waves are bigger, some of them are smaller, some of them would be easy to surf, some not. But all of them are equally wet. And you can't discover wetness by jumping from a small wave to a bigger wave, because the bigger wave is bigger, but it's not wetter. And wetness in Buddhism, for example, is called suchness or thusness. It's just the thusness of this moment is the wetness that they were all equally exposed to. No matter what wave we're on, doesn't matter if we're on a big wave or a small wave or anything in between. Wherever we are, we're equally wet. It's not wetter one place than another. It's the same with all of our states of consciousness. We have all sorts of different types of states of consciousness, alpha waves, theta waves, delta waves. But all of them are equally one with wetness, or that universal consciousness. And you can't discover that consciousness by jumping from one wave to another wave. It's present on all of the waves equally. And so it simply takes a realization of the suchness, or the thusness, or the isness of whatever state of consciousness you happen to have. And that's why it's too simple to believe, because it literally is 100% present with every single state of consciousness you have. It's not a change of state. It's the condition of all states. It's the blueness that all of them are drawn in. And that's what makes it so just radically different from any sort of type of manifest thing or event, that they all have dimensions, they exist in space, they exist in time. And this is the wetness of all of them. And that's what makes it so wild in that sense.
So perhaps computer consciousness isn't so much a matter of us programming it differently or doing anything physically, engineering anything differently. Perhaps it's maybe also accepting that computers are already conscious. They're already
that would be an interesting.
They already have that universal consciousness, as does everything. And
that's what's going to be.
The internet is every bit as complex and interconnected as a human brain. Maybe it is already.
Well, it's already wet. Manifesting is, and so the question is, can it ever become self-aware of that wetness? And that would be the trick. It's interesting, and frankly, it's not clear that. Well, let me put a different way. It might be the case that in order for any entity to become self-aware of its own wetness, that only human beings can do that. The Tibetans, for example, maintain that of all the 6 realms of existence, including hungry ghosts and animals and all of that, that only humans can, and the reason is just that they have a, quote, precious human body. Now, what that human body is, as we were talking earlier, is it's the repository of every single evolutionary stage up to the present. I saw one evolutionary biologist who estimated that if you look at the number of transformations in the evolutionary scale, there was something like 640,000 minor transformations, and the estimate was then there were between 20 and 100 major transformations. Now, I don't exactly know what that difference is. You can sort of guess, but I know that at least those 20 to 100 major transformations, that means there's at least 20 to 100 significant types of prehensions that we have enfolded in this precious human body. And that might be the reason that only this human body can be self-aware of that wetness. So, in other words, even though that universal consciousness is there all the time, and it's poking up in every one of those earlier little prehensions, it might only be that at the stage of human beings, that's the only stage that's complex enough and unified enough and relatively conscious enough to actually be able to be aware of its own ground, of its own wetness, to be aware of that universal consciousness. And if that's the case, then AI is got, its work doubly cut out for it, because it's going to have to do all that relative consciousness as well as that ultimate consciousness. But it might very well be that you need those relative stages in order to become self-aware of that ultimate unity consciousness. It makes a kind of sense to me.
I think that also maybe one way to look at it is that the individuals who are kind of cybernetically connected through the internet are the component, just like there's cells in a body, we are the components in a greater mind. That's kind of what I've been thinking of the internet as, is that next layer of evolutionary consciousness is the way our minds are now connected through the internet. And that in order for it to be conscious, one thing I've been speculating on is maybe in order to be conscious, it needs to understand what consciousness is. So those components need to we don't quite understand why we're conscious, but when we do, it will have that understanding because we will be using it to tell each other, and then it will have the definition of consciousness, and then it will be conscious.
And that point, that points towards the evolution of future evolution of the various forms of awareness that we have right now. And it might very well be that in terms of a sort of more collective realization by more and more humans of this ultimate unity consciousness, that what might be required is that we actually look at these sort of future developments in AI, but particularly look at them as, in a sense, cooperating with or being a part of human awareness. And of course, that's one of the ways that AI is looking to be developed now, is how to supplement human capacities and make them greater and better and so on. So if you look at when, for example, right now we're sort of developing this whole cloud that's surrounding the planet, and it's just this massive storage database. And then if we get to the point where we can inject several trillion nanobots into a human body, and those nanobots in effect would form another kind of neocortex outside of the organic neocortex that we already have, and then that would be in constant contact with the entire cloud. And you can start to see how kinds of unified awareness, how that could be kind of a substrate of those kinds of things. I think any of those kinds of directions make a certain amount of sense right now, simply because we really don't know right now how to plug into both our entire evolutionary history of consciousness and this ultimate unity consciousness, which appears to be the ground of all being. But you can certainly see certain future developments that could kind of appear to at least be heading in a direction like that.
One other thing I thought of when we were talking to Ann Watts yesterday is that I didn't get a chance to ask her this, but I was reading Alan Watts, and he said something about how we are all, this universal consciousness kind of playing this game where we're pretending not to be, and we're all kind of peeking into this reality, but we're peeking into it from the same, from that external universal consciousness. We are all just our own little perspectives looking inwards, and we're all just the same universal being experiencing itself. And one thing that I struggle with is the concept of moral behavior and inflicting, pain and violence, all the horrible things that humans do to each other. I don't know if I'm comfortable with the concept that we are all experiencing, we're all playing our parts in this play, and that there's almost like a victim blaming, where if somebody, was the victim of a serial killer, that they chose to experience this reality and to live and die a horrible death because the universal consciousness wanted to experience that itself. That's one area where I've run into a wall. I'm like, I'm not sure if I'm comfortable saying that victim of that serial killer, it was okay that happened because they wanted to, the universal consciousness wanted to experience, that little permutation of what a life could be.
Well, keep in mind that most of these esoteric traditions, although almost all of them started as very dualistic formulation. In other words, in Buddhism, for example, the way that Buddhism originally started was that the whole point was to discover nirvana, which was in a sense this universal consciousness, but it was this universal consciousness before it manifests any manifest form existing world of samsara, because the existing manifest relative world of samsara is a world that's inherently suffering, because it's divided and things are separate, and things crash into each other and they hurt each other and it's painful and you can't get out of it. So the only way you can get out of samsara, nothing you can do in samsara will help. You're always going to be suffering. All you can do is get off of samsara entirely, and you get off of samsara entirely by getting into nirvana. And nirvana is an actual state of mind. It's a state of complete cessation, technically called nirod. And in that state, it's very much like deep dreamless sleep. And when you're in that state, you're essentially free of pain, free of suffering, free of ego, free of desire, but it's a radical state of freedom, and it's completely pain-free and suffering-free. And this is a real state. It's a meditative state. You can get in it. And we saw shocking examples of it, actually, during the Vietnam War, when monks who were protesting the war would sit in this meditation posture, get into the nirvana state, the state of complete cessation, where nothing is arising for them, had their bodies doused in gasoline and set on fire. And right on live TV, they burned to the ground in ashes and never flinched once. I mean, nirvana is a very, very real state, and it's completely separate from samsara.
It's a state of non-being, though. It's a state of non-being. It's a state of non-being, almost, where...
in a certain sense, it's a radically formless, non-manifest, empty state, yes.
So the only escape from pain and suffering is do not exist.
Or to be
because all existence is suffering. But this is exactly what Nagarjuna criticized. And then he, again, was the founder of Mahayana. So the earlier Buddhism was called Hinayana, meaning small vehicle. And then Mahayana was greater vehicle. The reason it was called greater is Nagarjuna criticized, he spent all of his time actually criticizing original Buddhism. And his point was that the nirvana that the original Buddhists were seeking, he said it's a very real state. You can get into it. It's real. Go ahead if you want to. But it's not the ultimate state. Completely divisive. It's a nirvana that's radically divorced and split from samsara. And so, among other things, you can't help beings in samsara get their own enlightenment. So your goal is to become what original Buddhism would call an arhat. And an arhat is somebody who simply gets off the wheel of birth and death, gets off the entire wheel of samsara, and just stays in this unmanifest, formless state. And so Nagarjuna criticizes that as being a broken state, as being a partial state, as being dualistic. And he says that actually both nirvana and samsara are two aspects of an underlying wholeness. And that wholeness is what he said was unqualifiable. So he called it emptiness, but he also called it suchness or thusness. And so this immediate thusness or suchness actually contains both nirvana and samsara. In touch with this direct, immediate thusness, this non-dual ultimate reality, then you can get in the nirvana state, and whilst remaining grounded grounded in that formless ground. You let the entire manifest world of samsara arise, and you are one with all of it. And in that state, you can then help all sentient beings get their own enlightenment. And so that idea was called bodhisattva. And the bodhisattva is somebody who promised not to disappear into nirvana, but to unite nirvana and samsara, and therefore be able to help all sentient beings gain their own realization. Now, what that did was it took sort of ultimate truth and relative truth. It took absolute and took the relative, and it made them non-dual. So as the Heart Sutra would say, that which is emptiness is not other than form. That which is form is not other than emptiness. That meant that which is nirvana is not other than samsara. That which is samsara is not other than nirvana. And so what that means is that it's not just that you're this one being that's radically split apart from the entire manifest world, and that you can therefore sort of go in and you experience whatever you want to in that manifest world, and it doesn't matter because it's all illusory, it's all a dream state, and it doesn't matter. It's actually not two. It's non-dual with the ultimate state. So anything that you're going to do in the relative realm is going to, in a certain really profound way, it's going to respect the dignities of the relative realm, because that realm is a direct manifestation of spirit itself. It's not merely illusory. It's not merely a dream. It's not merely unreal. You still have to realize, you still have to have a satori. You still have to realize this ultimate ground. But then when you do that, you'll realize that it's essentially not two with everything that's arising moment to moment. So you would, in that non-dual state, you wouldn't go around and kill people, go around and steal things. And you would essentially be what some of the traditions would simply refer to as a righteous individual. And that does mean an essentially moral individual. If something horrible happened to you, if you end up in Auschwitz and you're in that non-dual state, then what that means is you will be able to handle that non-dual state, because you'll have access to that painless ground in your own being. And so that's why you'll literally be able to endure pretty much any sort of suffering. Do it just to find out what it's like, or just because you're going to kind of have fun with it. So that's not exactly. Alan Watts got to about the first half of his life. He was essentially a very careful and very brilliant scholar. His book, The Supreme Identity, is still one of the very best explanations of non-dual Advaita Vedanta that you can find. In half of his life, he just got kind of loosey-goosey and started kind of using a lot of metaphors, and started getting much more into kind of a pantheistic orientation. Very psychedelic, of course. He was still often, right on the money. Often, a little bit goofy. You can ask Anne about whether she agrees with that.
Well, we're coming up on an hour here. This has been an amazing conversation.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. Before we go, we'd like to ask you what you have the Buddhism book coming out in March, correct?
Yes, the most recent books I have, the sort of mega book that really goes into a lot of these areas, and especially in terms of what spirituality looks like. Because it's not only that core satori, it's how you interpret that satori. Mental psychology, it turns out, has told us a staggering amount about that. They don't know anything about satori, but they do know how we interpret spiritual ideas. We've even had empirical studies on that. And that changes religion entirely. Anyway, the book is called Religion of Tomorrow. And then just because it was hard to avoid, I ended up doing a small book called Trump in a Post-Truth World.
Yeah, we were going to talk to you about
and then
that. Sorry, we wanted to talk to you about what we ran out of.
It actually got a lot of attention. It went sort of semi-viral. And then the recent one on integral Buddhism, yeah.
Well, we've been trying our best to try and keep these under an hour, so we'll probably get back in touch with you and try and have you on again in the future. It's been a great conversation.
Okay.
Any other projects or websites or blogs or anything else you'd like to mention to our listeners before we let you go?
I just go ahead and check in. A lot of stuff we're doing is indeed on Integral Life, and that's a good place to check in. There are thousands of entries on that site covering all this kind of stuff.
That's integrallife.com?
.org, correct?
Or .org?
integrallife.org. Yeah, I think you can also get there with .com, but .org.
All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Okay, thank you all. Bye now.
Have a great day.
Thanks,
Bye.
man.
Thank you for joining us for the Conscious Community Podcast. If you'd like more information about sponsoring this podcast or advertising with Conscious Community Magazine, in print or online, please email me at spencer@consciouscommunitymagazine.com. That's SPENCER. or call 630-492-0831.